Encontrei ela ali, hoje de manhã, de barriga para cima. Revelou Dona Elodia, indicando um ponto na praia onde se juntava o lixo que o mar trazia ou desenterrava. Troncos, sacolas plásticas, garrafas. Envenenada? Acho que sim. O que fizeram com ela? Enterraram? Dona Elodia fez que sim com a cabeça e disse: meus netos. Lá em cima, no cemitério? Não, aqui mesmo na praia. Muitos cães do povoado morriam envenenados. Havia quem dissesse que eram mortos de propósito, mas Damares não podia acreditar que existissem pessoas capazes de fazer algo assim e achava que os cachorros comiam por engano as iscas com veneno deixadas para os ratos, ou comiam os ratos, que por estarem envenenados eram caçados com facilidade. Sinto muito, disse Damares.
O imenso moedor está triturando animais mortos recolhidos nas estradas. Tanto o barulho do motor quanto dos ossos sendo esmagados ricocheteiam nas paredes altas do galpão. A mistura de som e fedor enfurece os sentidos. Edgar Wilson deixa o carrinho no lugar delimitado por um retângulo pintado no chão e sobe os degraus de uma escadinha de alumínio que dá acesso à caçamba do moedor, de onde é possível ver o lado de dentro. Consegue ver o que é? Grita um funcionário afastando o protetor auditivo. Não estou vendo nada, grita de volta Edgar Wilson. Desde cedo tá assim, agarrando. Mas não estou vendo nada.
Sobre o autoritarismo brasileiro. Lilia Moritz Schwartz. Demorei aqui, Escravidão e racismo. No Brasil, o sistema escravocrata transformou-se num modelo tão enraizado que acabou se convertendo numa linguagem com graves consequências. Graçou por aqui, do século XVI ao XIX, uma escandalosa injustiça amparada pela artimanha da legalidade. Como não havia nada em nossa legislação que vetasse ou regulasse tal sistema, ele se espraiou por todo o país, entrando firme nos costumes da terra. Imperou no nosso território uma grande bastardia jurídica, a total falta de direitos de alguns ante a imensa concentração de poderes nas mãos de outros. Fim.
Se alguém for um espírito guardião, mandado pela primeira vez para habitar um hospedeiro que veio ao mundo em Umoniá, uma cidade na terra dos grandes pais, a primeira coisa a surpreender o espírito seria a imensidão da terra. Quando o espírito guardião desce, com o corpo reencarnado do novo hospedeiro em direção à terra, o que se revela ao olho é assombroso. Subitamente, como se alguma cortina primordial fosse aberta, estamos expostos a uma extensão de vegetação verde e luxuriante.
Quando retirei a faca da mala de roupas, embrulhada em um pedaço de tecido antigo e encardido, com nódoas escuras e um nó no meio, tinha pouco mais de 7 anos. Minha irmã, Belonísia, que estava comigo, era mais nova há 1 ano. Pouco antes daquele evento, estávamos no terreiro da casa antiga brincando com bonecas feitas de espiga de milho colhidas na semana anterior. Aproveitávamos as palhas que já amarelavam para vestir feito roupas nos sabugos. Falávamos que as bonecas eram as nossas filhas, filhas de Bibiana e Belonísia.
Um apartamento em Urano. Em termos biológicos, afirmar que são necessários um homem e uma mulher para levar a cabo um processo de reprodução sexual é tão ridículo quanto eram, em outros tempos, as afirmações de que a reprodução só aconteceria entre dois corpos que partilhassem a mesma religião, o mesmo sangue, a mesma cor de pele ou o mesmo status social.
Da mesma maneira que, enquanto estamos presos, não cremos na vida livre, que não podemos esquecer. Uma vez soltos, esquecemos a coerência interna da vida na prisão, de cuja realidade, no entanto, não duvidamos. Hoje sei que saí, venho saindo da prisão como quem sai de um sonho. Ao passo que, enquanto preso, eu julgava que Santo Amaro, o solar da fossa e a TV Record é que tinham sido um sonho do qual não era possível sair.
Às vezes você fazia um pensamento e morava nele, afastava-se. Construiu uma casa assim, longínqua, dentro de mim. Era esse o seu modo de lidar com as coisas. Hoje, prefiro pensar que você partiu para regressar a mim e não queria apenas a sua ausência como legado. Eu queria um tipo de presença, ainda que dolorida e triste. E apesar de tudo, nesta casa, nesse apartamento, você será sempre o corpo que não vai parar de morrer. Será sempre o pai que se recusa a partir.
Quando o menino tinha 4 anos, ele perguntou ao pai por que as pessoas precisavam dormir. O pai respondeu: para que Deus conseguisse desfuder tudo que eles fuderam. Quando o menino tinha 12, ele perguntou à mãe por que o pai tinha ido embora de casa. A mãe disse: para poder fuder com tudo que passar pela frente. Quando o menino tinha 13, ele quis saber por que o pai tinha voltado para casa. A mãe respondeu: eu tenho 41, eu não estou afim de ficar procurando alguém para fuder. Aos 14, quando os palavrões pareciam jorrar da boca dos amigos feito água num cano furado, a palavra foda não exercia nenhum fascínio sobre o garoto. Nenhum pingo.
Firme, não suporto o chão de seus fundamentos. Tô de saco cheio de chamar tua imprudência de lei. Cada noite conto meus irmãos, e pela manhã, quando alguns não sobrevivem para serem contados, conto as covas que deixaram. Estendo a mão ao povo preto, e toco apenas o ar. Seu truque de mestre, América. Ora ele respira, ora não. Abra cadáver. Macumba para turista. Feitiço que alega não praticar. Dá logo uma pistola ao meu primo para fazer o trampo por vocês. Eu tentei, gente branca. Tentei, branquelos, mas passaram o funeral do meu mano fazendo planos para um cafezinho. Falando alto demais, ao lado de seus ossos.
Ama, está andando pelo passeio do canal que divide a cidade. Algumas barcaças navegando lentamente nas primeiras horas da manhã. À esquerda está a passarela de inspiração náutica com tábuas estilo convés e torres tipo mastros. À direita está a curva do rio que se volta para o leste depois da ponte Waterloo, em direção ao dono de Catedral St. Paul. Ela sente o sol começar a se erguer. No ar, ainda uma brisa antes de a cidade ficar entupida de calor e fumaça. Uma violonista toca alguma coisa devidamente inspiradora mais adiante no passeio. A peça de Ama, a última amazona do reino de Daomé, estreia no Teatro Nacional essa noite.
Chegou um ponto em que os habitantes de Marte não podiam mais negar o aquecimento do seu planeta ou a escala da destruição que estava por vir. Em uma última tentativa desesperada de preservar sua civilização, eles construíram vastos canais conectando os polos do planeta à grande extensão de terra arrasada que cobriu o resto da superfície. O degelo anual das camadas de gelo polares produziria a água necessária para o cultivo de alimentos suficiente para a sobrevivência de pelo menos mais uma geração.
Educação indígena. A educação na aldeia indígena começa desde a primeira idade. Não segue os padrões de sala de aula. É um aprender sem pressa na solidariedade. Aprende que a agitação da formiga e o canto do sapo indicam que a chuva vem aí. Aprende a apreciar desde pequeno um bom peixe assado com vinho de açaí. Aprende que na arte de pescar só se pesca o que vai precisar. E a calma é importante para a flecha no peixe acertar. Aprende com os mais velhos nossa memória viva, com os espíritos conversar e deles a permissão receber para na mata entrar.
Eu não tinha porra nenhuma pra fazer lá. Quer dizer, por que será que moro com a minha ex-namorada, sua nova namorada e a ex-namorada dela? Como é que alguém pode se sentir bem assim? Eu poderia estar escrevendo essa história de uma cela de cadeia. Engraçado, né? Ted e Alice, antes da minha partida, disseram: nada é tão ruim que não possa piorar, Eileen. Eu não sabia mais o que fazer. Peguei um voo sim, eu fiz isso. Pra Portland. E a Julie e a Chris me buscaram no aeroporto. Eu estava muito doidona no avião.
Encontrei ela ali, hoje de manhã, de barriga para cima. Revelou Dona Elodia, indicando um ponto na praia onde se juntava o lixo que o mar trazia ou desenterrava. Troncos, sacolas plásticas, garrafas. Envenenada? Acho que sim. O que fizeram com ela? Enterraram? Dona Elodia fez que sim com a cabeça e disse: meus netos. Lá em cima, no cemitério? Não, aqui mesmo na praia. Muitos cães do povoado morriam envenenados. Havia quem dissesse que eram mortos de propósito, mas Damares não podia acreditar que existissem pessoas capazes de fazer algo assim e achava que os cachorros comiam por engano as iscas com veneno deixadas para os ratos, ou comiam os ratos, que por estarem envenenados eram caçados com facilidade. Sinto muito, disse Damares.
O imenso moedor está triturando animais mortos recolhidos nas estradas. Tanto o barulho do motor quanto dos ossos sendo esmagados ricocheteiam nas paredes altas do galpão. A mistura de som e fedor enfurece os sentidos. Edgar Wilson deixa o carrinho no lugar delimitado por um retângulo pintado no chão e sobe os degraus de uma escadinha de alumínio que dá acesso à caçamba do moedor, de onde é possível ver o lado de dentro. Consegue ver o que é? Grita um funcionário afastando o protetor auditivo. Não estou vendo nada, grita de volta Edgar Wilson. Desde cedo tá assim, agarrando. Mas não estou vendo nada.
Sobre o autoritarismo brasileiro. Lilia Moritz Schwartz. Demorei aqui, Escravidão e racismo. No Brasil, o sistema escravocrata transformou-se num modelo tão enraizado que acabou se convertendo numa linguagem com graves consequências. Graçou por aqui, do século XVI ao XIX, uma escandalosa injustiça amparada pela artimanha da legalidade. Como não havia nada em nossa legislação que vetasse ou regulasse tal sistema, ele se espraiou por todo o país, entrando firme nos costumes da terra. Imperou no nosso território uma grande bastardia jurídica, a total falta de direitos de alguns ante a imensa concentração de poderes nas mãos de outros. Fim.
Se alguém for um espírito guardião, mandado pela primeira vez para habitar um hospedeiro que veio ao mundo em Umoniá, uma cidade na terra dos grandes pais, a primeira coisa a surpreender o espírito seria a imensidão da terra. Quando o espírito guardião desce, com o corpo reencarnado do novo hospedeiro em direção à terra, o que se revela ao olho é assombroso. Subitamente, Como se alguma cortina primordial fosse aberta, estamos expostos a uma extensão de vegetação verde e luxuriante.
Quando retirei a faca da mala de roupas, embrulhada em um pedaço de tecido antigo e encardido, com nódoas escuras e um nó no meio, tinha pouco mais de 7 anos. Minha irmã, Belonísia, que estava comigo, era mais nova há 1 ano. Pouco antes daquele evento, estávamos no terreiro da casa antiga brincando com bonecas feitas de espiga de milho colhidas na semana anterior. Aproveitávamos as palhas que já amarelavam para vestir feito roupas nos sabugos. Falávamos que as bonecas eram as nossas filhas, filhas de Bibiana e Belonísia.
Um apartamento em Urano. Em termos biológicos, afirmar que são necessários um homem e uma mulher para levar a cabo um processo de reprodução sexual é tão ridículo quanto eram, em outros tempos, as afirmações de que a reprodução só aconteceria entre 2 corpos que partilhassem a mesma religião, o mesmo sangue, a mesma cor de pele ou o mesmo status social.
Da mesma maneira que, enquanto estamos presos, não cremos na vida livre, que não podemos esquecer. Uma vez soltos, esquecemos a coerência interna da vida na prisão, de cuja realidade, no entanto, não duvidamos. Hoje sei que saí, venho saindo da prisão como quem sai de um sonho. Ao passo que, enquanto preso, eu julgava que Santo Amaro, o solar da fossa e a TV Record é que tinham sido um sonho do qual não era possível sair.
Às vezes você fazia um pensamento e morava nele, afastava-se. Construiu uma casa assim, longínqua, dentro de mim. Era esse o seu modo de lidar com as coisas. Hoje, prefiro pensar que você partiu para regressar a mim e não queria apenas a sua ausência como legado. Eu queria um tipo de presença, ainda que dolorida e triste. E apesar de tudo, nesta casa, nesse apartamento, você será sempre o corpo que não vai parar de morrer. Será sempre o pai que se recusa a partir.
Quando o menino tinha 4 anos, ele perguntou ao pai por que as pessoas precisavam dormir. O pai respondeu: para que Deus conseguisse desfuder tudo que eles fuderam. Quando o menino tinha 12, ele perguntou à mãe por que o pai tinha ido embora de casa. A mãe disse: para poder fuder com tudo que passar pela frente. Quando o menino tinha 13, ele quis saber por que o pai tinha voltado para casa. A mãe respondeu: eu tenho 41, eu não estou afim de ficar procurando alguém para fuder. Aos 14, quando os palavrões pareciam jorrar da boca dos amigos feito água num cano furado, a palavra foda não exercia nenhum fascínio sobre o garoto. Nenhum pingo.
Firme, não suporto o chão de seus fundamentos. Tô de saco cheio de chamar tua imprudência de lei. Cada noite conto meus irmãos, e pela manhã, quando alguns não sobrevivem para serem contados, conto as covas que deixaram. Estendo a mão ao povo preto e toco apenas o ar, seu truque de mestre, América. Ora ele respira, ora não. Abra cadáver, macumba para turista, feitiço que alega não praticar.
Fica de olho aí. Como a gente um quadradinho, retorno. Lá a gente volta retorno também, acho que sim, né?
Eileen, please.
Me formei em História, né? E fui no
I
mestre.
graduated in history. I got a master's in history from the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro. I came to work as a historian for the museum here, the historical museum, the Fortress Museum, as it's called. It's a museum that tells visitors and people, the townspeople, to tell this town's story. This museum was founded with this mission. So ever since the beginning, I began to do research work, studying in the archives in Rio de Janeiro and the local archives here in Paraty. And I got this material together, which is a booklet, a brief history of Paraty. It's a text which focuses on a narrative which is based and focused on the documents. And this necessarily ended up deconstructing several myths with the story of Paraty, since there's little historical, it's a historical town, but it's focused more on tourism, so there isn't that much concrete history. So you don't talk about the problems. A tourist town doesn't talk about inequalities. You try to tell a more pleasant story of the town. So when you go and look at the documents and the historical documents, it was an attempt to do an historical overview, but with a few revisions of what had previously been considered the official history of the town. The town is filling with people ever since Cinema Novo. Flip has always been a festival that I attended to drink cachaça, kind of on the fringes of the festival. You may have run into somebody. There's a party in a townhouse, and we went over to take advantage of the parties. For so long time, things were happening with the authors in the author's tent. I didn't really pay much attention to it. It was like there were kind of highfalutin older people who were participating. I thought it was an interesting movement in more recent years with Flip, precisely because of having the fringes of the festival. There was a lot more interesting than the official festival. Meanwhile, if you take a look at the impact of Flip on the town as a whole, it's a huge impact, almost brutal in some senses. The process of it was kind of a gentrification. It was one of the vectors for gentrification of the town, and that time where the local residents of the historical center had to flee. It became like a historical shopping center almost. As it says in the lyrics to this song, it's a historical shopping center. So Flip played a role in this and a lot of other factors as well. It was the tourism dynamics that changed in the last 20 years. So there's this impact, and a critical view of this is always very important and necessary, I think.
Ministério do Turismo e
The Ministry of Tourism and the Casa Azul Association present the 18th Paraty International Literary Festival. Flip receiving tax incentives from a federal law, the Valley Plus Culture and official sponsorship from Itaú Bank, support from the municipal government of Paraty, Pinheiro Neto attorneys, and you all, organized by Casa Azul, the Special Secretariat for Culture under the Ministry of Tourism of the Brazilian federal government.
Esta mesa é ao vivo.
This round table is live, and questions to the author can be sent in throughout the broadcast through the chat box on YouTube. At the end of this meeting, some of these questions will be addressed to the guest speakers and authors.
Hoje, sexta-feira.
Today, Friday, December 4, this excruciating year, 2020, 2 weeks from the end, I, Bruna, and Beber, and an author, she is Mariana Ruggieri, a poet and translator and professor of literature. We are here for the 18th edition of the Paraty International Literary Festival to welcome Eileen Myles, poet who will be speaking of the United States and of whom we are admirers, readers, translators, and two people who spread the word of Eileen's work in Brazil. Here, they've published two of Eileen's books, the novel Chelsea Girls, translated by me in 2019, and For Which Tree I'm Waiting, translated by Mariana, Camila Said, and Chesley Rodriguez. through Jabuticaba Editions in 2019 as well. This roundtable intends to raise questions concerning the work and life of Eileen, and the center will be Eileen's poetry will give a brief introduction of Eileen's life, and afterwards we will begin. Good afternoon, Eileen. Good afternoon, Mariana. Good afternoon, you all. Welcoming us in your homes. Okay, Eileen Myles was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and moved to New York in 1974 to become a poet and a novelist, speaker, and she Eileen writes on memoirs, essays, the best performances, Super 8 film, and acted in several audiovisual production, including The Fourth Gender. The most recent book for now, October 2020, it's Wire Right from Yale University Press with other authors. In 2019, I received the award from the Poetry of the American Academy of Arts in Texas. In beginning, we want to say that Eileen uses they as the pronoun. It's a Portuguese, the English and Portuguese grammar. We're trying to eliminate the gender marks whenever possible, but especially if you're going to be following the discussion in Portuguese, we ask to wish for the translation team, which will be alert and attempting to speak a language. It's not exactly a foreign language, it's also not our native language. We'd like to ask Eileen to read 1981. The reading will be in English, after which I will translate into Portuguese.
Okay. Hi, glad to be here. This is Notebook 1981. I was so willing to pull a page out of my notebook a day, several bright days, and live them as if I was only alive, thirsty, timeless, young enough to do this one more time, to dare to have nothing so much to lose, and to feel that potential dying of the self in the light as the only thing I thought that was spiritual, possible. And because I had no other way to call that mind, I called it poetry. But it was flesh and time and bread and friends, frightened and free enough to want to have another day that way, tear another page.
Caderno 1981. Eu estava tão disposta a arrancar uma página do meu caderno, dia, vários dias luminosos, e vivê-los como se estivesse apenas viva, sedenta, temporal, jovem o bastante para fazer isso mais uma vez, para ousar não ter muito a perder e sentir aquela morte em potencial do ser na luz, como a única coisa que eu pensava ser sagrada, possível. E como não tinha outra maneira de nomear esse espírito, chamei de poesia. Mas era carne, tempo e pão e amigos assustados e livres o bastante para querer ter outro dia daquele jeito, rasgar outra página. Bom, obrigada, Eileen, por estar aqui com a gente.
Thank you, Eileen, for sharing with us this afternoon. I want to begin by asking, Notebook 1981 was published in Evolution from 2008. I heard you speaking somewhere that this is a new old poem. It could refer to another time even. It was written recently, however, and Bruna, in the introduction to the anthology of poems that we published, she comments that your poetic production is older than our democracy in Brazil. When you launched your first book in 1978, the irony of the leash, we were living under a military dictatorship. Sandra Rios was an openly lesbian author. Sandra's work was censored when you began to write. I'd like to know, how was it to become a poet during this period? And it was already evident to you, this relationship between poetry and politics, for example. Was it already obvious to you?
Yes and no. I mean, I think maybe, I think there was probably less conflict between poetry and politics when I first started out. There was still a sense, like I came to New York in the mid-'70s, and the 60s and 70s, at least culturally, poetry was very popular, and it seemed like it was just part of politics. It was threaded in there. It was part of feminism. It was part of what had been called Black Power. It just, every political movement seemed to have their poet, and poets had a real feeling for becoming part of that. That changed in the 70s and 80s, though, and I think it's almost as the culture became more about money and capitalism became front and center in the art world, poetry's status lowered, and poets continued to be political, but also less heard. And so, if you wanted to talk about politics, you wouldn't. The connection was kind of severed, and I think probably in the 90s, maybe with AIDS, politics and poetry, I think became much more passionate and connected. And it's, and I think by now it seems like people are really reaching to poetry, and because we're communicating through social media and in all these more fragmented ways, and poetry is so swift in that platform.
In this book, the irony, the leash, you say in a poem called talking about poetry. My attitude towards poetry is basically this: I should be doing something to make more money.
Mm-hmm.
This attitude vis-a-vis poetry, does it remain? Chelsea Girls was going to be called Bread and Water. Do you think that the poetic scene, the architecture of the poetic scene, has changed with the professionalization of writing?
Oh, absolutely. I think people anticipate having a career as a poet now, and there's much more. And also, it's much more interpolated with the academy in a way that it wasn't. I mean, I think there was though most people that how I knew were college educated, not many people even had advanced degrees when I first came around. And again, that started to change in the 80s. So I think that there was just a kind of a digging in your heels feeling about being a poet meant, well, there was a split. I mean, I think the ethos was being a poet meant that you were going to be broke, and that was simply it. And so you should do things like write about art, or I mean, that was about the only career choice. Otherwise, you should watch out for being a drug addict, because that was the ultimate fate of the poet too. And so early on, there was a sense that you were going to, though you were part of the culture, you were the poor part of you were the poor part of the culture. There was rock and roll, there was poetry. Even I think poets would know. I mean, like Andy Warhol was a friend to poets in the 60s and 70s, but he would buy the poet a hamburger. It was still, it was sort of like there was an economic dependency that was part of the myth of poetry when I first came around, and that's so not the case now. And I think there are poets who are really, I mean, both prominent. I mean, like I'm thinking of a young poet like Ocean Vuong, where his book of poetry will turn up on a TV show. There was nothing like that. I mean, it's funny that we had what was the show about advertising? Mad Men. Like Mad Men had the character reading Frank O'Hara, but that was retro. You know what I mean? That was that was not the present. That was the past. So in kind of a reconstruction of the past, we would include poetry, but now it's actually included in the present, which is kind of amazing. So I think it probably creates more angst for a young poet, because you don't expect to be as struggling as hard as you're struggling, because I think there's an expectation that there's gold in them there hills,
Bom, e pensando pouco, então, dando
Thinking a
continuidade.
little bit more and continuing with this question, if you really created your own space, so you, Eileen, you're participating in the St. Mark's Poetry Project, you created Dodgems. It's a magazine, which means it's like Dodgems. It's like a dispute or clash in New York School, language poets. So you're creating spaces with poetry at the same time that you are involved with feminism, but also creating your space and spaces. So you launched Ladies Museum. You created 2 plays, Spiritual Entertainment and Patriarchy. So if you could talk a little bit about this and creating your space.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think when I came around, I mean, there were lots of things. I felt I came from a working class background, whereas the poetry world felt very middle class, and in a way, even though people were, you know, in this cult of poverty I mentioned, there was still a sense that people came from middle class backgrounds, and I didn't come from that. I felt like there was a conversation I had not already been in college. I didn't know any poets. I mean, I wanted to be a poet, but I didn't have like a community when I came to New York. And so I felt wrong in many ways. And I think I didn't yet, I mean, I was being actively heterosexual while knowing that I was probably gay, but I wasn't ready to be that person yet. And so the feminism and lesbians were sort of over here. And I didn't like their poetry so much. I admire Adrienne Rich, but I don't like the work so much. It's not very avant-garde. So I kind of felt these conflicts. And even in the poetry world, because I was very unsophisticated when I arrived, it was all these men that I would meet would say, read this, don't read this, don't read this, read this. And I didn't have my own taste yet. And so I was very excited about the idea. And I was starting to read about physics and the uncertainty principle. And, you know, the art world was very interested in you know, science and Buddhism and random, you know, collisions. And so I think I tried to, in my magazine, I wanted to show my own consciousness, which was growing through all these gaps and these collisions. Like, how could a feminist be New York school, be you know, just these things seemed disconnected, and the only way I could understand my practice was to make that be a place where these things would meet. And so it kind of introduced me to pastiche in a way, you know, the idea of making poems that were collages, you know. So yeah, poetry in my magazine became a place to try and reconcile things in me and in the culture that didn't seem to be friends.
Falando em conciliação e indo
Talking about reconciliation and performance, there was a focus between the 70s and 80s of poetry public, and you begin to get involved with performance from that point on. In your book Inferno, you comment that the reading styles of other people, the reading of other people, I would like you to talk a little bit about the relationship between page, body, and voice in your poetry.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, I feel like performance has always been important to me as a poet, because initially I wasn't published. I didn't know how to, you know, I mean, I had a very, you know, kind of contest, like I thought publication was like a contest. You know, you would send your thing in to these obvious places and you would get rejected. And I had no idea until I had a community how I would get in print. But what was open and available were readings. There were mics, open mics in bars and in, you know, art galleries all over New York when I first arrived. And so my introduction to being a poet was giving readings. And also I was more familiar with singer-songwriters culturally than I was with poets. So I knew, like, you know, Joni Mitchell had very good lyrics. There were all these, you know, songwriters that I had grown up hearing that were my model for coming up to the microphone and singing. And so I think that I brought a kind of feeling of being a singer that didn't sing to the microphone, you know? And so that I think that, and also I was self-conscious about class. And so I felt I had the wrong accent. And so I decided, and I wasn't sure I had permission to be a poet. And so I thought that if the poems sounded like me in my natural speaking voice and in my natural accent, then people wouldn't, you know, basically tell me to go away. I was entitled by the sound of my own voice. I wasn't pretending to be anything, because poetry styles seemed to be very like, I was willing to pull a page out of my notebook. There's a very awful poetry tone that some poets used, and it seemed like they would go into this other voice and they would make every single word be very important. And I didn't feel like I spoke like that. It felt it was a class issue in a way. I felt like poetry, the excitement of the tumult, like the whole, like the whole bombardment of words seemed to be the exciting thing, rather than one word or two words, or worrying about whether you heard every single word. And so I think I learned, as time passed, I saw more, like David Wojnarowicz, the poet and writer and visual artist, read so fast. And he was a model for not worrying at all whether you got all the words. And I realized that was like action painting and poetry, to actually be more taken by your own breath and your own performance than worrying that the audience was getting the poem correctly, And so, but later I think it was difficult, because by the 80s and 90s, there started to be slam poetry and different kinds of poetry that were very much about being in the body and competing, having slam competitions. I don't know if you had that in Brazil. There was a very almost mainstream kind of poetry style that was performance poetry. And I wasn't part of that, and I didn't want to be part of that. But because I'm a good reader, people would sometimes describe me as a spoken word poet, which felt sort of anti-intellectual. So it's, there's always tricky politics about it all, and I started to understand that writing itself is a performance, very much. It's sort of like it's an improvisational performance that is rendered permanent by the fact of writing. So I was seeing a video from 1977 you were reading, and then and I was aware to the speed. There's a certain pace and a certain speed in your reading, as if you were, holding your breath. Everybody in the room also holding their breaths, but considering your poetry, your work, and your writings, I guess the pace sometimes has nothing to do with the speed itself, but more with the difficulty in understanding, how you went from point A to point B, like there was a magic happening in between, and the pace is responsible for that magic. It's a bit like, when you edit a film. So if we could maybe think about this, this relation between your poetry and video, and also maybe poetry as an addition, editing a film. If you could maybe talk about this, poetry as a way of recording something, and then editing, you can, cut and paste different things. So if you could talk a little bit more about that. Yeah. I think that for me, I think poetry is the best medium for mortality, because I feel like every poem is like a little life and a little death. It's sort of like it's sort of like you're entering into this silence, and you create this noise or this sound, and it's so important when the poem ends, and you want to stop, and you want the person to be kind of jolted a bit, and I'm not sure. I sometimes don't know where that comes from. I think that my father died when I was quite young, and I witnessed it. And so sometimes I think that, like, do you know the word chakra? Like we have these, all these systems in our body that, people that do acupuncture, but I think that, like, I think ideas of death are written on our chakras. Like some people think of death as sleepy, and some people think of death as like sudden, and my death is sudden. But also, because film is more familiar to me, again, than poetry. And I think that I've always liked the way film cuts from the visual track to the voiceover. And so in a poem, I think you're always kind of giving a little bit of visual and then putting a caption to it. And then once the caption sinks in, you lean into the world a bit. And it's almost like you're doing a voiceover of the world and making the reader do some of the work. You want the reader to kind of fill in the picture that you're just kind of like when you write a screenplay, it's so interesting how they have those set moments where they tell you the location. And sometimes I think poetry is like that you're just trying to, I hate adjectives. I don't like adjectives at all because I feel like they slow down the poem and they don't make the reader do the work. You're feeding them and you're acting like they're babies, and I think that it's like, and also I think people listening to a poem are thinking their own thoughts. If I sit at a reading, it's very funny. You sit at a reading and you're like, you see other poets take words down and then daydream. And there's a lot of wandering. Nobody's taking in all those words. And so I feel like that gives me the freedom to jump and leave spaces for the other person's thoughts so that they can kind of, give air to the poem, and so it becomes sort of a collaborative thing in a way.
Pensando nesses dois aspectos.
Yes, considering these two aspects, one is the text and the video, and the poem within a text. And also linking this to an answer you were giving to the previous question in terms of permission to become a poet. There is an interesting writing in Chelsea, which is The Light Warrior, where you talk about all these different topics. And here, I would like to ask you if you could read maybe an excerpt, and then I will read the translation. I did it into Portuguese. Okay. Do you have any? Should I just read the first page of it? It's 1, 2.
Pode ser a primeira página.
It could be the first page.
Sure.
And a little bit of the ending too, if you could.
Okay.
When you get to Joan of Arc.
All right. My name means light warrior when you bring it home to the present through Latin and Gaelic. I am a significant person, maybe a saint or larger than life. I hear that you judge a saint by her whole personality, not just her work. I'm beginning to see my work as my shadows, less and less necessary, done with less and less care. I see my existence as similar to that of a sundial's when I simply stand and slowly the notion of movement is suggesting itself to my consciousness, and action is also appropriate in the realm of the saint. The character who begins her life in the windows of a church, in the religious air of her own imagination, until history lines up with her nature and the path becomes clear. The storms of identity erupt and implode and gather again, and one of life's soldiers realizes her whole basis for living has changed, and now she is impelled forward in a new film. And now I'm going to jump right to the end a bit. My oddness, my embarrassment also confirmed my specialness. My father had entrusted me with a junior classics comic book about Joan of Arc, the first woman I aspired to be. It was an instruction manual, and if the girl, Joan Salinger, had sidled over to me in the schoolyard and said, "Let me have it, Eileen, light warrior," I would have silently passed her the honor. I have waited all my life for permission. I feel it growing in my breast. A war is storming and it is behind me, and I am moving my forces into light.
Guerreira da Luz. Meu nome significa Guerreira da Luz quando você o traz para o presente através do latim e do gaélico. Eu sou uma pessoa importante, talvez uma santa, ou maior que tudo isso. Eu ouvi dizer que você julga uma santa por vários aspectos de sua personalidade, não só pelos trabalhos que realizou. Estou começando a ver o meu trabalho como vejo meus fantasmas, cada vez menos necessário, feito com muito pouco cuidado. Entendo a minha existência como a semelhante de um relógio de sol, quando estou simplesmente parada. E de maneira lenta, a noção de movimento sugere isso à minha consciência, e a ação é também recomendada no domínio do sagrado. A personagem que começa sua vida nas janelas de uma igreja, em meio ao ar devoto de sua imaginação, até que a história se alinhe à sua natureza e o caminho se torne claro. As crises de identidade explodem, implodem e se refazem. E um dos soldados da infantaria da vida percebe que toda a base de sua existência mudou e que agora algo mais forte o conduz em direção a um novo caminho. Minha excentricidade e meu constrangimento também confirmavam a minha singularidade. Meu pai tinha me confiado esse gibi, desses para iniciantes, sobre Joana d'Arc, a primeira mulher que eu quis ser. Era um manual de instruções, e se a garota Joan Salinger tivesse se sentado perto de mim no parquinho da escola e dito: "Empresta para mim, Eileen, guerreira da luz", silenciosamente eu lhe daria essa honra. A vida inteira eu esperei permissão para fazer as coisas. Eu sinto isso crescendo no meu peito. Uma guerra se arma bem atrás de mim e eu direciono minhas energias para a luz. Então, ficando na
considering Joan of Arc, you're launching already a book. You have already launched it, and it's now being published. It's called For Now. It's How I Write, the series. We talked about that, about your process of writing. So considering in general terms, your poetry, if it is possible to define in any way your poetry, do you think that we could consider a type of Joan of Arc poetry, considering boldness, pioneerism, genderqueer, Catholicism? Sure. I mean, I think that, and it's very funny too. I have to admit, like, in the original, I used the feminine pronoun, and it's such a struggle. But I don't believe in changing my work in the present. You know, it's like I'm not going to rewrite it. It's like what she wrote. And I feel, and that's an interesting experience in reading work that I've written years ago. But I think that coming up as a female and somebody that had conflicts with being female, I mean, and I think no matter what your gender is, I think that, the limitations on women culturally and what the expectations are, definitely made me be trawling all through my early life for female figures that were exciting and were doing things that they weren't supposed to do. So there was this amazing model of Joan of Arc, who was, who's such a warrior and a visionary and died in such a burst of flame. And I just, I grew up Catholic, and I, at confirmation, when we had to take a confirmation name, it was in the 60s. And so all the other girls were taking Bridget for the very sexy Bridget Bardot, the movie star. And then when they asked me what my name was, it was Joan. And I just felt like I was this very serious little man girl, that wanted to be a hero or something. But she was kind of like a rock star in Catholic school because she had so much power. And I've learned too that it's like there were many Joan of Arcs in the Middle Ages. It was like, I always thought of it as like performance art. I think there was so much unrest and so much, class strife and poverty and discontent that people were breaking out and having visions all the time and talking to God and leading other people to doing things. And it was kind of like performance art in a way. Like in the 80s and 90s, when there was a lot of political unrest in America, performance art and poetry were breaking out. It was the only way to have a vision, was to take this to take the stage and make these kind of crazy speeches, So I'm very fond of this piece because it is about all that feeling of being young and feeling shrouded in darkness and silence, and knowing that you had greatness in you and just going crazy with it, and I've got a secret. I'm a light warrior, And but I think it is about becoming an artist and becoming heard and becoming known and being willing to step up and say who you are and what your mission is.
Bom, e aí pensando nisso,
And then considering this, in becoming a known artist, how do you negotiate what is public, what is fact, what is generic, what is private, what something that has to do with you, but also has to do with other people? So when I ask this question, I'm considering a text you wrote in response to Marjorie Werloff, where you're in a certain way preparing a transparency theory. So if you could talk a little bit about this transparency, writing, this negotiation between public and private, how do you work with that? I mean, I think I was in that particular piece, I was having a confrontation, I suppose, with a critic who was simplifying my work. And I think that because I would use details in my work that seemed personal and autobiographical, that I wasn't, I mean, I think she had a very certain idea of what poetry was and what it didn't do, and I think that if you weren't, I mean, some of the writers that she supports are friends of mine, and I love their work, but it was kind of like somehow, I mean, I in a way, I can't even, I'm not really the right one to talk about what Marjorie considered transparency, because I feel like the web of consciousness that I was presenting with as my writing, I think had too much stuff in the gate, like when in film, I think they used to talk about when we used film instead of video, it would be like, there would be like a piece of dust in the gate of the film, and you would see it rattling when the film would run. It would be like this light, and it would be, and I felt like aesthetically, I think Marjorie's aesthetics were seeing my divulging in my work as dust in the gate, and was not adhering, was incorrectly transparent or not transparent, or I mean, like, I think my relationship to form was not being considered at all, because I thought you have to be here or there. You're either making a surface that is appropriated, or you're telling a personal story. And I think that seemed like a very simplistic reading of materiality and writing, and how we organize and arrange, and how we make a complicated surface. I think a surface is always mixed, I think, and I have to say, I think I've won the argument too, because I think increasingly as time passed, I think that, like, even with language poetry, when they were anti-narrative and anti-personal, I mean, everybody started to move over and start appropriating the I in new ways. And I think that, and even the complexity in my own work, I think, has been kind of accepted now. But I think it's like homosexuality. It used to be, I mean, I always had this thing that, like, if you put, it's like an aquarium. If you put a drop of lavender ink into an aquarium, all the water becomes purple, and all people can see is gayness, because it's simply homophobia that does that. It's not that the work is all gay. It's just that the person doesn't want any of that to make their water be kind of mixed. So I'm going to talk. Maggie Nelson has a beautiful chapter on your work, a book, and a beautiful chapter on your work. And she refers to, I always put my pussy. And she said, this is my country when I'm here alone in public. It's from a poetry. And for Maggie Nelson, this is an aspect of the right of being, of existing as a queer person, to be alone with other queer people in public without running any risk. So being alone in public is sometimes, I think, a gesture of poetry. If poetry isn't a way of being shared solitude, shared solitude. If you could talk a little bit about that too. Yeah, no, I think that's really true. I think that I mean, I think it's funny. I think so many poets, what I admire in their work is how good they are at being alone. You know, they create a very private, very beautiful state. But I think too, as we know, I think when you it's like being with a group of people in a situation and there's a conversation going on and you want to say something, but you don't feel like what you have to say is part of the conversation. And so you keep, or I would keep trying to, I mean, this is when I was younger, but in any situation where I feel like I can't figure out how to be part of it. And so I would wait and try and imagine attaching my thought to somebody else's thought, trying to find some way in. And what I've always discovered is that if you actually enter the conversation, what you're actually thinking at that moment, if you almost forget about what the conversation is saying and just put your own thought out, you enter it in the most thorough way possible. You know, like every conversation, I think, is this kind of voyage between the interior and the exterior, you know. And I think it's sort of like this, if you kind of take this interior message and put it out, I think there's this shock of the real, you know. And I think that that's what everybody is striving to do all the time, and it's how we create community, is these kind of dissonant moments where the community then kind of gathers around you and holds you in a way, and it just becomes more and more complex and rich. So I think that like I think you know, it's sort of a very like it was a very embarrassing lyric. I always put my pussy in the middle of trees. I mean, I think I was probably thinking about pissing in the woods, you know, but it was I just thought it was a funny, strange line, and it was so naked, and why would that work? But I think that is always the shock of poetry, is that we're kind of making these bumper stickers for a public that doesn't exist yet, and you're kind of writing it and making it and printing it all in one gesture, and then it winds up being kind of, you know, passed around in that way that the internet passes messages around. And weirdly, I wrote that piece for a dancer. I was writing a score for a dancer who I had a crush on, but I couldn't tell her. And so I was writing a text for her to say, so she would put it on her body, which was very funny. So I basically had these feelings and had these thoughts, and then I gave her this language, and then she was clothed in it, you know, and it was very dynamic.
Pensando sobre a
Thinking
solidão.
now of solitude and loneliness, can we allow us to write? And solitude is so dear and important to poets in general. I asked myself, we asked ourselves, how it's been for you to live this period in the pandemic, this new period in the pandemic. How is this solitude and distancing, and how has it been to produce and create, especially to imagine at home, to imagine more than anything else? And we're even accompanying this struggle the East River struggle near your home. So we'd like to know about that. That was the question, to imagine during the pandemic, to produce and write.
Yeah, though you kind of jumped to the East River at the end, and I'm not sure except they must be related. Well, I think for the
Não tem uma relação.
There is a relationship. There's a relationship because we thought of the surroundings of your house, your apartment, around where you live, where you circulate, where you normally circulate, because where you move through the city. So this is clear in your texts, in your poems, this movement.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I for the early part of the pandemic, I was in Texas, and God, I mean, I was there with my dog, and it was very difficult. I felt like it reminded me of puberty. It reminded me of being a young writer, beginning again. It reminded me of when I first, in the 80s, I stopped drinking and taking drugs because I was probably going to die if I kept going. And so there was a time when, if you take away these substances from your body, for a time you're very, you feel great, but you're very confused mentally. It just was, when I first stopped drinking, I was afraid I wouldn't be able to write anymore because I was in this kind of fog, and there was so much light and air, and I felt so clean that I didn't know. So I think there was a similar disorientation for me in the beginning of the pandemic, because I feel like so much of my practice has been about, I work for a little while, then I go out, I see some people, I sit, I just, engage with other people to get away from the self. And there wasn't that kind of muscular rhythm. There was only pictures of people like we're having right now, and I would get something, but I wouldn't get the same thing. And so I just was continually trapped in my own strangeness, and it was strange to become so estranged from your own loneliness, and but what was interesting was that I was in Texas. I was working on a new novel, and I was doing very well in the fall, and now it was the spring, and I wasn't doing what I was writing. Seemed really crazy and diffuse and all over the place. But interestingly, I wrote a lot of poems. Like, poems seemed to come very easily in the pandemic for me, and because it started to seem that I was very aware of anything else I was inside of, and that I would see the adventure. Like, I would write I was watching a very long Bela Tarr film, a 7-hour film. And it started to be, I was living inside of something that was inside my house, that was inside the pandemic. And so I had this new neighborhood, and I could write poems inside the Bela Tarr film, So I just became differently, and I became very aware of the birds outside my house. They became more interesting and more layered. And so weirdly, my and meditation was very good, because I felt like you wouldn't think that more silence would be good, but in fact, it was exactly what I needed. So there were all these ways of stripping the artifice from the pandemic and creating new spaces, and new spaces were very adventurous. But now that I'm back in New York, yeah, it's very true that I'm very dependent on the shape of the land, and Manhattan is surrounded by 2 rivers, and the East River is my river. And I've run and walked and biked and walked dogs along this, this body of water for 40 years. And so this political travesty is I don't know how to get away from it. And I'm afraid, it's time to go to Texas. Like, my girlfriend and I had planned to go to Texas for 2 months, and I keep saying no, because I feel like I keep needing to leave my body here to be near this, because I don't know when they're going to start killing trees, and I want to chain myself to trees or do something. I don't know what, I keep writing things, and nobody wants these pieces that I'm writing. And it's like that. It's funny to feel like a well-known poet, that then when you knock on the door of the news media, they're like, they don't even, they want a different kind of person talking to them, I think. And I don't know how to get that access either. So it's been very painful, and it's been like a new kind of silence, because I'm watching this public crime be enacted, and I can't figure out the way in, and I don't want to leave. Yeah, it's very strange. It's really, it's a real violence to the rhythm of my life, and I feel helpless, and it's a bad feeling. Yeah. Thank you for asking.
Passamos às perguntas. Vamos. A gente vai passar a pergunta do público agora.
We're going to have a question from the audience now, if that's okay.
Sure.
Can we ask this one? Okay, the first one is, Eileen, is it possible, even after so much knowledge, we didn't get the first part of the question. The question is, Anderson.
Você ouviu?
Did you hear the question? Ask them to
I
repeat.
know I heard something about knowledge. I didn't hear the whole question.
Então vou repetir.
I'm going to repeat the question now.
Please.
Is it possible to be an outsider after so much recognition and acknowledgement? Can you still be an outsider?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I just, it's very relative, because some people would see me as having privilege. And I think that, but I think that it's that only certain discourses are allowable in certain situations, I mean, I think that, and I think, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like you can have power and authority are really disconnected, I think, culturally. Probably, I'm sure that's global, that one can have authority within their own, communities, and yet have no power to actually necessarily access other communities on your own terms. Like, I'm always invited to be part of things, I'm always asked. It's almost like you become, I mean, it's all very good. My writing is very good, but I think you start to become commodified as a certain flavor. And that flavor is invited. We'd like some of that on this meal, and we'd like a little bit of that over here. But to kind of create your own, I don't know, to have your own mission is still the same problem it always is. It's never clear who else will embrace your mission, who else will take this message forward. So I've had this struggle with politics. And even, I think in the writing world, it's sort of like there's still, this different aesthetics that are still more celebrated in mainstream literary culture in America. So I'm kind of regarded as sort of an outsider on the inside, which is interesting and powerful in its way, but still has, the limitations. There's all these invisible walls culturally that you feel the glass ceiling of where you're allowed to speak, or which I don't know whose poet you are. You could be a guilty pleasure even, So I think it's very complicated. I think I don't, in a way, I don't think it's my, I mean, it would be nice, but I don't think it's really my work to understand my work in terms of where it goes and where it doesn't go. I think that takes you towards madness, those, to try and apprehend how you're being apprehended, But I feel a fluidity, and I feel a limitation, of course. It's just, it's at another scale,
Agora da Transparent, né? Bom, então a última pergunta foi feita
So the
pela...
last question was by Dani Fonseca, and the next one, this next question here is by Anderson. Anderson asks, your experience in participating in Transparent.
Oh, and what is the question? What about it?
Your experience with that, participating, your experience in Transparent.
Well,
Eileen, poet and character.
Yeah, no, I mean, I
Ray.
think it was fun to be a character on a TV show. It was very funny, and it was liberating, because of course the character that they made was not me, and so I didn't feel, they would show me wardrobe, and they would say, would you wear this? And I would say no, and then they would put that on the character. I mean, it was very funny. They would consult with me about me, but that they still wouldn't necessarily take my advice. I would say no. They would wear tighter jeans, and then they would have the person in loose jeans, because that was the lesbian they wanted, But my relationship with the actor was very good, because Cherry Jones was very smart, and she has a Southern accent. But what she did was she listened to me reading, and she kind of did my reading style in her own accent. So she did a very interesting translation of how I read, and I was very impressed. I think it was funny, though. It's very funny to have people learn about your work through television. I was talking about other younger writers whose work has been on TV. But yeah, to have my work recited on a TV show and to have people becoming, I mean, it just, I think that's only a wonderful thing, you know? And I've always joked about it because I felt like culturally I was more affected. I'm the generation that grew up with television, you know, and so TV was huge to me. And so for my own work to then be distributed, so I'm affected by it, and I'm very much a creation of it in a way. And so then it was very ironic that my own work would be distributed through television. You know, it seemed like a wonderful irony and a great success in a way. But I think in another way, but see, I think that still is part of the limitation, because I think people would then perhaps think of me as such a famous poet that, you know, they don't go here, they don't need this award. You don't need this, you know, you've been on television, so we don't give you this book award, you know. So it's sort of like, I think the poetry world is often very weird about success. They love it, and then they think you're not one of us now, you know, because you're on television, you know, or you've gotten a lot of attention in the media. So it's very funny. You could then be, there's a reverse snobbery that we have, you know. So there's always a new kind of suffering that goes with the new kind of celebration, you know.
Estamos chegando. Tem mais?
We're reaching the end. We have another question from whom? Frank. Pedro Frank wants to know if you met Smith. She was all over the place. She wants to know.
Patti Smith?
The mic went off. The first name of this, was the last name. Patti Smith. Patti Smith. If you met Patti Smith.
Have I met Patti Smith?
Yeah.
Yes. It's very funny. I've met her a number of times. I think she's not very interested in my work. But it's very weird because I always get compared to her. People always say Eileen is like Just Kids. And I was like, no, I'm not. I mean, our work is very different, but and she's very funny. She's like, when I was at a poetry reading once, and it was like Richard Hell, me, Patty, we were standing in one of those small circles that poets stand in at readings. And Richard went to Patty, said, do you two know each other? And I had not met Patty, but at that point. And she put her head down and she said, yeah, in the old days. And so she sort of avoided meeting me by pretending that she had already met me before. But now we go to there's a vegan restaurant in my neighborhood. And I was sitting there having dinner with somebody in the spring, and Patty came in. And I just thought the thing to do is to be normal. Because of course when I was young, she was like, when I first came to New York, she was my hugest hero. And she's only like a few years older than me. We're sort of the same generation. But she came to New York in the 60s. She lived in New Jersey, so she was here. I was not here for another 10 years. So it's New York generations are about when you came to New York, not what age you are, you know? But so she was standing there in the restaurant. And so I just yelled, hey, Patty. And I was like, Eileen. She goes, yeah. And I introduced her to my friend, and it was like we were just pals, and it was very normal. So yes, I have met her. We have not hung out. Patty and I have not hung out, but we're in the same place very often. And I'll even buy ice cream and somebody will say, you look like Patti Smith. And I don't look like Patti Smith, but I think there's only one way to be my age and female. And Patti Smith, I think, has branded that look.
So, unfortunately, all good things come to an end. If you want to say anything else, we're almost coming to the end. Feel free.
No, I mean, the only thing I just feel is something, and it's very blurry and strange about gender and being female. And I feel like it still is being invented every day, all the time, in a new language. I think in a certain way, I think people still don't know who or what we are. And so I feel like so much of the purpose of making art as a queer person or as a female person or as a trans person is to keep expanding the definition and the possibilities of who we are and where we are and what we make, you know. And I think it continues to be the great adventure, and the people who love us, whether they be men or female or trans, you know, it's sort of like it's a gain for everybody, you know, to be part of this grand experiment, you know, to bring the interior out and radicalize the present of the world. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for bringing my work to Brazil. I think I'm very grateful, and it's great to have this conversation with you. Obrigado.
Obrigada a você, né? Obrigada.
Thank you.
Yay.
We're so happy and to share this, and we'll have the recording on YouTube later.
Okay.
So good evening.
Cool. Ciao. Hey. Bye. We're all leaving now, right? Are we waiting for Sandrine? I think we did good.